Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to take a look at the brand new book, Wonders from Your Law, written by Kevin Chen and published by IVP Academic. Thank you to IVP for sending me a copy for review. This is my honest take on this book. So let me take you through my typical format of the summary of the main idea of the work, some comments on the research behind it, some comments on its readability, its style, and then some overall comments and reactionary thoughts at the end. So let's dive into it. This is a super interesting one. Wonders from Your Law is an intertextual Old Testament theology project. So let me comment on some of the parameters of kind of what's going on in this book and what this book is seeking to accomplish. So broadly speaking, this is very much a book in the biblical studies kind of category of academic work. But within that, it's a book that comes from and I hesitate to use these terms because they're so loaded, but it comes from an evangelical biblical theology perspective. So what that means, what I understand that to mean, is that it's approaching the biblical text with an academic rigor, but also a kind of a presupposition of its canonical and literary unity. So it's not, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but if you read a lot of biblical studies works, there's kind of different fractured camps. And there are certain biblical studies scholars and streams that are interested in dissecting the origins, proposing different sources for different traditions, trying to look at way things have been edited together over time and compiled. And that's not what this book is doing. This book comes from a different angle, which is kind of almost presupposing a unity to the biblical and scriptural literature, like assuming that there's a wholeness to it, a canonical unity to it, and looking at it as an overarching kind of literary corpus or a library. And so looking at it to analyze it more from that, which is a different way of getting at it than trying to get behind the text and see where, what historical sources are behind it and where they've been edited or smoothed over, or it's not coming from that historical critical angle. It's coming at it from more of a broadly evangelical consideration of the unity of the text, and looking at what are some bigger picture literary things that we can learn from the unity of it, from the masterful compilation of this. And so it's very much, that's the biblical theology idea. It's proposing, or it's assuming kind of there's a holistic theological way you can look at the scriptures, and especially see how allusions and foreshadowing and references back to earlier texts, like these things all work together to put forward something that's larger than the sum of its parts, so to speak. That's how I would kind of try to briefly summarize the biblical theology movement within kind of evangelical academic work. And Kevin Chen is very, very, very much within that. There's a series of commentaries. I have a handful of them behind me on my shelves from New Studies in Biblical Theology. That's a series of academic commentaries on biblical, on scriptural material that also comes from the biblical theology world. I would say the Bible Project is a very popular manifestation or representation of the biblical theology movement. So I'm just trying to situate this book within all that. If you don't have no idea what any of I'm talking about, just skip this whole part of the review. But if you are interested in biblical studies and the different kind of camps that exist, you'll know hopefully where this one's coming from. So, and he does a lot of work at the beginning to situate this book within biblical theology academic work. And that's a really interesting chapter, again, if you are interested in some of the academic weeds on all this stuff. So he does a really, I think, good job reviewing the landscape of biblical theology, and especially Old Testament theology, and then situates himself where he overlaps with, and especially where he disagrees with certain other scholars that have done notable work here. So, okay. That's a little bit of a preamble to the main idea, but that's where this book is coming from. The main idea of this book is he's proposing this way of approaching the Old Testament texts, the Hebrew Bible, through looking at what he calls nexus passages. And he uses the analogy, I like this analogy, he uses the analogy of a subway map, or a public transit map. And he talks about, when you look at, especially in a big city with lots of routes, there are certain nexus points where lots of lines, whether it's buses or trains or whatever, lots of lines come together, and those are important stations where you can transfer lines, and you can get to lots of places by going through these nexus points. So he uses that as an analogy for considering the entirety of the Old Testament scriptures. And so he is seeking to, in this book, he identifies 10 nexus passages, which he would say are these important stations on the subway, so to speak. There are 10 passages that he identifies as important intertextually that are referenced a lot and also reference earlier points. There's kind of these almost, to mix metaphors a bit, there's like this gravitational center to these passages that seem very weighty by virtue of how much they're referenced in the Old and New Testaments, actually, how important they are for the literary kind of whole presentation and the whole narrative and the entire thing that's unfolding in the biblical canon. So his idea is that you can get a theology, a holistic biblical theology, or at least a holistic Old Testament theology, by paying attention to these densely referenced passages that he calls nexus passages. And so what he does in Wonders from Your Law is there's a chapter, he identifies 10, although he says there's more than 10 that you could go with, but he identifies 10 that are well spread out through the Pentateuch, through the poetic passages, through the prophetic literature. So the entirety of the subgenres of Old Testament writings are represented by these 10 selections, and there's a chapter on each nexus passage going into the ways it's referenced, there's exegetical work in the languages, in Hebrew. He also talks about the numbers of time, the ways it alludes to things in the other passages, and more importantly, how it is alluded to. Each nexus passage is alluded to a lot in the rest of the scriptures. So that's what each chapter is, a deep dive into each of these 10 nexus passages, and he talks about how these things combine to really reveal important themes in the entirety of the Old Testament corpus. So, Wonders from Your Law, it situates the book in its literature review, and then it does 10 chapters on these nexus passages and proposes kind of a thematic look at what are the important themes. Again, if you presume a kind of canonical, holistic, literary, unitary voice in the Old Testament, then you can look at it this way and see these takeaways. So, that's kind of a lot, but this is a pretty meaty book, which I'll get into now with the research. This is very much an academic book. I mean, this is a book that will probably be assigned in seminary courses in Old Testament theology. It's not an intro book. It's not, it's not the most accessible. It's academic. I mean, when you have an entire chapter that's a literature review and grounding the project within the field of and the history of biblical theology, I mean, you're not reading, this is not a popular level work. So the research is very academic. It's very much in the academic world. There's a lot of academic publications and journal articles referenced. There's a lot of his other work. There's a lot of linguistic work with Hebrew language in particular referenced. There's a lot of discussion of the Hebrew work there. So if that's all just not of interest to you, you're going to have probably a hard time getting through this one. It's very academic. It's very well researched. It's also importantly, one thing I wanted to point out, it's very much in conversation with the scriptures as narrative kind of world of academic work, and particularly John Sailhamer, who wrote the Pentateuch as narrative. It was one of his famous books. So Chen and Sailhamer are very much in conversation here. Chen relies a lot on Sailhamer's work to kind of lay the ground, although he also parts with him. But that's so I bring that up to say, if you like Sailhamer's way of getting at things, you're probably really going to resonate with the way that Kevin Chen gets at things. Or anyone that's kind of in Sailhamer's, like, adjacent to him in his orbit of way of getting at stuff. If you like the way the Bible Project talks about the narrative of the Old Testament, you're probably going to resonate a lot with what's going on in this book too, although this is a bigger academic swing. Okay, so the readability of it. This is where I have a nuance or a wrinkle in this review. I wrestled with the style of this book. I found it very, I don't know if workmanlike is the right term. I found it a little on the dry side. I found it very straightforward and matter of fact, stylistically. And so I really had to really push to just keep working through the material. It's work to work through this material. It's not something that holds your hand or necessarily goes down super easy. Although it's not difficult to understand. It's not inscrutable. It's not overly jargony or anything like that. It's just very methodical, workmanlike, straightforward, pretty dry. It's in that kind of vein. So it's not hard to understand, and I don't want to overstate that part of it. I actually found the content pretty rich, and I found it very, on a content level, interesting. I'll say more about that in my reaction, but stylistically it was a little bit of a drag. And so that's a little bit of a wrinkle in kind of my takeaway on this one. But it's an academic text, and so like there's a tension there. Like, how much do you expect these deeply academic and rigorous works to be, a gripping novel. It's not really going to be like that. So this one takes a bit of work to get through, but I don't want to belabor that point. Finally, I'll talk about my reaction. I'm going to try to tie my reactions together. So I really like the academic biblical theology movement in general. I love that commentary series I mentioned earlier, New Studies in Biblical Theology, that IVP also puts out. I really like all of that. I really like the narrative and especially literary sensibilities that people like John Sailhamer bring to studying the Old Testament. So I like all of that stuff, and I think this book is a really solid and helpful entry into academic evangelical biblical theology work. I think the certain chapters are really striking in terms of when he goes into like Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, for example. When he goes into the numbers of references and even the allusions that come up in the scriptural corpus, it's really wild. It's kind of head-spinning to see how densely interreferenced these important passages are in the whole Old Testament witness. Some people are not going to be convinced, especially when you talk about the Bible quoting itself. That's fairly obvious when that happens. But when you get into the territory of allusions or alluding to things, that's obviously super contested territory. Not everyone's going to be convinced about the number of allusions he brings up, but he does important and detailed work to make his case, so he's not lazily proposing these allusions, but not everybody's going to agree. But if you go with him, and if you even just consider momentarily like, wow, if all these allusions are right, then there's a lot of intentional literary artistry happening in this broad range of genres and time and writings. It's really an amazing thing, and it's something that actually it's one of the reasons I love studying the Bible and scriptures, is because I do think this stuff comes up. And it's a really good, this is a really solid reference for an intertextual allusions through all through the Hebrew Bible. So it's really rich. It's really carefully researched and argued. And it's a very helpful, I would say it's a very helpful reference tool, and it's something I'm keeping on my shelf because especially when I teach or preach through Old Testament texts, especially when they intersect with these Nexus passages, I will absolutely be referencing this book for some help in seeing where else in the Old Testament these threads and these webs kind of connect to. But it's not highly readable. So for me, it falls in that category of of kind of tools and analytic tools and helpful material that I'm glad exists, that is hard for me to know who all to recommend it to, because I don't know how many people would enjoy just picking this up and reading it. You might be, if you're a super analytic person, you actually might like the straightforwardness of this one. If you're someone who's really intrigued by the idea, like think about Robert Alter, The Art of Biblical Narrative, those kinds of writings. If you're intrigued by that and you want to know more and you want to get another argument into how densely intra-referenced the Old Testament books are, this is a pretty important, I would say, and pretty important work. So I'm walking through my reactions and all that to give you a good sense of whether or not this is something that you should buy or pick up or spend some time with, because it's not for everybody, but it's a really good tool, and there's a lot of really good work being done by Kevin Chen, and in this book in particular, within that certain stream of biblical studies. So those are my thoughts on Wonders from Your Law. Hopefully that helped you kind of orient yourself to what this book is and whether or not you might want to spend some time with it. But as always, thank you for taking some time to watch.